The Concordance hub hung like a multifaceted jewel against the velvet black of the Nexus sector. It was a marvel of pan-galactic engineering, a neutral ground where beings whose biology and philosophies spanned galaxies could meet, negotiate, and more often than not, perpetuate the ancient grinding calculus of interstellar power. Its vast rotating rings housed embassies, conference chambers, and observation decks, all bathed in meticulously calibrated atmospheres and lighting, a monument to a fragile, often strained peace. Within the grand chamber, under a ceiling that simulated the star-dusted canopy of deep space, the current session was reaching its predictable, bitter conclusion. On one side sat the delegation from the Zylos hegemony. Matriarch Zethra, a towering figure whose chitinous exoskeleton gleamed. Like polished obsidian clicked her primary mandibles softly. The Zylos were insectoid, ruthlessly pragmatic, viewing the galaxy as a resource to be managed, their hegemony as the most efficient managers. Treaties, to them, were merely tools, to be used, bent, or discarded as the collective required. Opposite them were the Corthelan Imperium. Grand luminary Corval appeared as a column of shimmering sapphire-blue crystal. His thoughts communicated through resonating light patterns and precise synthesized tones. The Corthelan were silicon-based, ancient beyond measure, prizing stability, order, and the rigid interpretation of laws they had largely written over millennia, laws that enshrined the Great Balance, a delicate equilibrium maintained primarily through their rivalry with the Zylos. Between them, figuratively and literally, sat Sky Master Harok of the Glim. His avian features were drawn, his brightly colored plumage seeming dull under the chamber's neutral light. He represented Chirix, a world rich in hypermatter precursors, and his people, the Glim, were currently bound by a century-old treaty that allowed the Zylos hegemony near-total control over their planet's resources. The Treaty of Zilar is clear. Matriarch Zethra's translated voice buzzed, devoid of emotion. Resource extraction rights were granted in exchange for protection. The hegemony has provided protection. The hegemony extracts resources. The arrangement is optimal. Optimal for the hegemony. Harok chirped, his voice trembling slightly. Our world suffers. Our people toil for scraps. The treaty was signed, under duress after the Great Blight. Irrelevant, interrupted Corval, his light patterns flashing a cool, dismissive blue. The treaty stands. It was ratified according to Concord protocols. To challenge it now without significant cause, such as a violation of the Great Balance, would introduce chaos. The Imperium values order. Harok slumped, his plea a familiar, dying echo in the chamber. The Corthelan wouldn't intervene because Zylos' actions didn't threaten them. The Zylos wouldn't yield because power was their right. It was the way things had always been. In an observation booth high above the floor, the human delegation watched. Ambassador Corvus Valerius, a man whose calm gray eyes missed nothing, steepled his fingers, a thoughtful expression on his face. He'd been a lawyer, before diplomacy called, and the blatant perversion of law he saw here grated on him. Beside him, Linnea Petrova, his sharp-witted political analyst, cross-referenced the Treaty of Zilar with Concord precedents on her datapad, her lips pursed in concentration. It's airtight, Corvus, she whispered. Built on power, signed in, desperation but legally sound by Concord standards, they're trapped. Soren Jurgensen, the cultural liaison, leaned forward, his focus entirely on Harok. Soren's uncanny empathy, his ability to read the subtle cues of vastly different biologies, was his greatest asset. He's beyond despair, Soren murmured. He's approaching the breaking point. The Glim won't survive another cycle under these terms. Humanity was a minor player here, a recent addition to the Concord, mostly valued for their adaptability and, occasionally, their unpredictable perspectives. They had no real power to sway the Zylos or the Corthelan. They were expected to watch, to learn, and to stay out of the way. But Corvus Valerius hadn't come to the Concordance hub just to watch. He saw the Glim, and in them, he saw the fundamental flaw of the galactic system. It was a system built to manage conflict between giants with no regard for those caught underfoot. It was a system, he believed, destined to fail, not through war, but through its own inherent injustice. As the session adjourned, confirming the Zylos' rights for another standard year, Valerius made a decision. It was time to introduce a little human unpredictability. The next session was intended as a formality, a rubber-stamping affair to close the Chirix file until the next review cycle. Matriarch Zythra was already planning her fleet's increased extraction quotas. Grand Luminary Corval was preparing his archives for the session's legal codification. Skymaster Harrock sat in stony silence, a portrait of defeated dignity. The air hung heavy with the weight of foregone conclusions. Then, the small, unassuming light indicating a request to speak from the Terran Alliance booth blinked on. A ripple of surprise went through the chamber. The humans rarely spoke in major plenary sessions unless directly addressed. Zythra shifted her multifaceted eyes, a hint of annoyance in her posture. Corval's light patterns flickered with mild curiosity. With a silent gesture from the presiding neutral arbiter, the floor was granted. Ambassador Corvus Valerius descended, the grav lift to the central podium. He moved with an unhurried grace, his simple dark blue diplomatic suit a stark contrast to the Zylos' imposing forms and the Corthelan's crystalline grandeur. He activated the universal translator, his calm, measured voice filling the chamber. "Honored delegates," he began, his gaze sweeping across the powerful figures before him. "The Terran Alliance has observed these proceedings with great interest and deep respect for the long-standing traditions of the Galactic Concord." He paused, letting the polite standard opening settle. "We recognize the importance of stability," he continued, "and the intricate framework of treaties that maintain the great balance. Yet we must also ask, can true lasting stability be built upon a foundation where the rights and well-being of some are deemed secondary to the interests and power of others?" A low buzz came from the Zylos delegation. Corval's light pulsed a questioning yellow. This was not the expected platitude. "We have witnessed the plight of the Glim," Valerius stated, his voice gaining a quiet firmness. "We have reviewed the Treaty of Xlar, and while we acknowledge its legality under current Concord interpretation, we must assert that legality and justice are not always synonymous." Now the chamber was silent, a tense, shocked silence. Harrock looked up, his avian eyes wide. "Humanity's own history," Valerius went on, "is fraught with examples of legal systems that perpetuated great harm. We learned, through painful experience, that peace without justice is merely a temporary ceasefire. We believe the galaxy deserves more. We believe all sentient species deserve more." He looked directly at Zythra, then at Corval. "Therefore, the Terran Alliance proposes a new principle to be considered in all future Concord negotiations. We call it the Terran Mandate. It is simple yet, we believe, profound. It posits that all sentient species possess certain inherent rights: the right to self-determination on their homeworlds, the right to fair and equitable trade, free from economic coercion, and the right to protection under Concord law, regardless of their technological or military standing." The shock solidified into outrage from the Zylos. "Infantile sentimentality," Zythra's translator snapped. "Rights. The only right is that which serves the collective strength and survival. Your mandate is weakness, Ambassador. It invites chaos." Corval's response was colder, sharper. "Ambassador Valerius, your proposal is unconventional. It lacks millennia of precedent. It disrupts established cosmic law. The great balance relies on predictable interactions based on known power dynamics. Introducing such moral variables would destabilize the very foundations of galactic order. It is frankly dangerous." Valerius held his ground. "Is a stability that crushes worlds like Chirix truly stable, Grand Luminary? Or is it merely a pressure building towards an inevitable and far more chaotic explosion? We believe a system based on shared ethics is, in the long term, the strongest and most stable system possible." He finished, bowed slightly, and returned to his booth, leaving behind a chamber buzzing with disbelief and anger. Linnea Petrova was already charting the immediate political shockwaves on her datapad. Soren Jurgensen watched Harok, who seemed for the first time to be breathing freely. The Terran Mandate had been proposed. It was radical, it was naive, it was dangerous. It had been dismissed and derided, but it had been spoken aloud in the Grand Chamber. And in the cold, pragmatic halls of galactic power, some ideas, once spoken, refused to die. The Concordance Hub, usually a place of carefully managed interactions and predictable orbits, felt subtly different after Valerius's speech. Delegates from minor worlds whispered in shaded alcoves. Zylos patrols in the common sectors seemed more numerous, their impassive carapaces radiating a cold vigilance. The Corthelan maintained their aloofness, but their sensor sweeps felt more intense. The Terran Mandate, though officially dismissed, lingered like an unexploded mine in the diplomatic field. That evening, a priority Alpha Com request bypassed, standard channels appearing directly on the secure network aboard the Axiom. The human diplomatic vessel docked at the hub. It was coded with Glim encryptions, layered and almost panicked in their construction. Soren Jurgensen, with his linguistic gifts, quickly identified the sender. "It's Skymaster Harok," he reported to Valerius and Linnea in the ship's private briefing room. "He requests an urgent, clandestine meeting aboard our ship. Says it's too dangerous to meet anywhere else." "The Zylos are watching him," Linnea stated, pulling up hub surveillance logs. "His quarters, his transport, even his comms. They're all under heavy, if subtle, scrutiny." Valerius considered it. Meeting Harok was a risk. It would signal direct human involvement, crossing a line from proposing a principle to actively engaging with one of its potential beneficiaries. It would undoubtedly provoke the Zylos. "His fear is palpable," Soren added, "but underneath it there's a spark. Your words, they lit something, Corvus." "Then we cannot turn him away," Valerius decided. "Arrange it, Soren. Utmost discretion. Linnea, prepare a full breakdown of Glim Zylos treaty vulnerabilities and Concord protocols for petitioning. If Harok is coming, he needs more than just hope. He needs options." Hours later, Skymaster Harok, smuggled aboard via a human cargo hauler making a routine supply drop, stood in the Axiom's briefing room. His feathers were ruffled, his eyes darting nervously, but there was a fire in them that hadn't been there before. "Ambassador," Harok began, his voice low and urgent. "Your words. The mandate. Do you truly mean it? Can such a thing exist in this galaxy?" "We believe it must exist, Skymaster," Valerius replied calmly. "It will not be easy. The powers you saw today will resist. But humanity stands by this principle. We cannot fight your battles, but we can offer our support, our knowledge, our voice." Linnea stepped forward, bringing up a complex flowchart on the holo display. "Skymaster, according to Concord Statute 7, subsection Delta 4, under the ancient, Wrong's protocols largely ignored for centuries, a signatory species can petition for treaty reevaluation if they can prove existential threat or gross unforeseen imbalance arising from its execution. The Zylos rely on the treaty's age to make it seem immutable, but its age might also be its weakness if argued correctly under these older protocols." Soren added, "And culturally, Harok, if the Glim people were to speak with one voice, a unified plea invoking these ancient laws, it would be harder for even the Corthelan to dismiss it out of hand, especially given their reverence for ancient things." Hope, fragile but real, bloomed on Harok's face. He saw a path, narrow and perilous, but a path nonetheless. We would need time to convince my people, to prepare." Even as they spoke, Linnea's datapad flagged an incoming message. It was a formal communication, routed through official channels, from Matriarch Zethra to Ambassador Valerius. It was brief, couched in chillingly polite diplomatic language. It spoke of the long-standing productive relationship between the hegemony and the alliance, the importance of non-interference, and expressed confidence that the Terran delegation would avoid any actions that might destabilize sensitive, Established agreements. It's a threat, Valerius said, his voice hardening slightly. They know or they suspect. They're warning us off. Harrock trembled. I have endangered you. You have given us a chance to stand for something, Skymaster. Valerius corrected him. He looked Harrock in the eye. The choice and the risk must be yours. But if you choose to walk this path, humanity will walk beside you in the halls of the Concord. Harrock left the Axiom as stealthily as he arrived, carrying not just a data chip full of legal precedents, but something far more potent, the first ripple of a human-inspired shockwave and the dangerous, intoxicating weight of hope. The Zylos had drawn a line. Valerius had chosen not to step back. The days following Harrock's visit were a masterclass in Zylos intimidation and Corthelan obstruction. Zylos health and safety inspections suddenly plagued Glim freighters across the sector, grinding trade to a halt. Hegemony, scientific surveys, began in orbit around Chirix, a barely veiled show of force. Matriarch Zythra, in public forums, spoke condescendingly of impressionable younger races being misled by idealistic, unproven philosophies. The Corthelan, meanwhile, employed their preferred weapon, bureaucracy. They proposed new subcommittees to study the long-term implications of theoretical ethical frameworks on established treaty law. They requested millennia-spanning historical data from Earth, burying the human delegation under mountains of procedural requests. Grand Luminary Corval intended to entomb the Terran Mandate in red tape until it suffocated. Aboard the Axiom, the human team worked tirelessly. Linnea navigated the Corthelan labyrinth with infuriating precision, answering every request but subtly weaving the Mandate's principles into her legal arguments. Soren maintained covert contact with Harrock, advising him on how to rally his people and frame their argument in a way that might resonate, however faintly, with other minor species. Valerius engaged in endless, frustrating meetings, calmly deflecting Zylos pressure and patiently chipping away at Corthelan inertia. Then word came from Chirix. Harrock had succeeded. The Glim High Council, after days of fearful debate, had voted. They would formally petition the Concord. The day Skymaster Harrock stood before the Grand Chamber again, the atmosphere was electric. He no longer looked defeated. His plumage seemed brighter, his voice clear and resonant as he invoked Concord Statute 7, subsection Delta 4. We, the Glim of Chirix, he declared, do formally petition this august body for a re-evaluation of the Treaty of Zlar. We do so on the grounds of gross imbalance, threatening our very existence, and we invoke the principles of self-determination and freedom from coercion, principles recently articulated, but inherent in the very spirit of a just concord. He didn't just ask for relief. He framed his plea using the language of the Terran Mandate. It was a direct public challenge. Matriarch Zythra's mandibles clicked rapidly, a clear sign of agitation. Her voice, when it came, was cold as vacuum. This is an outrage, a procedural trick instigated by outside influences. The Glim have no grounds. Their imbalance is merely the efficient functioning of a long-standing agreement. This petition is frivolous and must be dismissed. Grand Luminary Corval's light patterns pulsed a deep, troubled violet. While the invocation of Statute 7 is technically permissible, it is highly irregular and disruptive. To challenge a century-old treaty based on abstract principles risks unraveling the entire legal fabric of the Concord. It sets a dangerous precedent, but Harrock had done his homework. Guided by Linnea, the protocol exists, Grand Luminary. It requires a formal hearing. To dismiss it out of hand would be a violation of Concord law. He had them. The Zylos couldn't crush the petition without breaking the very laws they sometimes used to their advantage. The Corthelan, for all their love of order, couldn't ignore their own ancient protocols, however inconvenient. The Terran Mandate, the indecent proposal, was now officially on the agenda. It wasn't just a human idea anymore. It was tied to the fate of a species, a legal challenge the great powers couldn't simply sweep aside. The first ripple had become a wave, and it was heading straight for the heart of galactic power. Valerius watched, knowing the true fight, the diplomatic gauntlet, was just beginning. The Concordance hub became a pressure cooker. With the Glim's petition now officially tabled, the Terran Mandate was no longer a philosophical curiosity, but a political firestorm. The Zylos and Corthelan, forced to engage, unleashed their full diplomatic arsenals, not with warships but with whispers, threats, and mountains of procedure. Matriarch Zythra's strategy was one of isolation and intimidation. Zylos trade advisors began visiting other minor systems, subtly reminding them of their economic dependencies on the hegemony and the dangers of aligning with destabilizing influences. Supply shipments vital to several neutral worlds suddenly faced unforeseen logistical delays. A Zylos research fleet established a temporary base uncomfortably close to a Terran Alliance shipping lane, a clear, silent threat. Within the hub, Zylos delegates spread rumors. The humans were naive fools, or worse, cunning manipulators seeking to upend the great balance for their own unknown, sinister ends. Grand Luminary Corval employed a more insidious approach. The Corthelan delegation flooded the Concord committees with requests for clarification, demands for impact studies, and complex legal challenges based on obscure precedents dating back before humanity had even discovered fire. Their aim was simple: delay, obstruct, and bury the Glim petition and the mandate under such a weight of procedure that it would collapse under its own complexity. They argued with chilling, crystalline logic that applying a new principle to an old treaty was an ex post facto absurdity, a legal impossibility that threatened the very concept of signed agreements. Aboard the Axiom, the human team was under siege. Linnea Petrova seemed to live on stim packs and sheer willpower, her desk a whirlwind of data pads and legal texts. She met every Corthelan challenge head-on. "They cite the Treaty of Vorlag Prime, 7th Millennium," she'd mutter, pulling up a file. "Fine. We counter with the Cathar. No, wait, Calaxy Accords, 9th Millennium, Article 5, which allows for ethical review under extreme duress. It's never been used, but it's there." She fought their wall of precedent with a rapier of deep research, finding cracks, loopholes, and forgotten clauses. Soren Jurgensen, meanwhile, worked the fringes. He couldn't openly lobby. That would play into the Zylos' narrative of human manipulation. Instead, he spent his time in the hub's cultural exchange centers, its interspecies cafes, its quiet observation decks. He listened more than he spoke. He shared human stories, music, art. He built quiet relationships with delegates from a dozen minor worlds, the Peltar, the Shen, the Yabrii, not asking for their vote, but fostering a sense of shared vulnerability and a nascent understanding of human ethics. He wasn't building an alliance, he was building empathy, a far more subversive force in these halls. Corvus Valerius bore the brunt of the direct pressure. He endured closed-door meetings with Zythra, where veiled threats were laid bare. He navigated labyrinthine debates with Corval, refusing to be drawn into endless procedural traps. His argument remained consistent and, to the great powers, infuriatingly simple. The Terran Mandate wasn't about undermining old treaties, it was about building a foundation for future ones. "Matriarch," he'd say, his voice calm. "An empire built on fear and exploitation must constantly guard against rebellion. Is that truly optimal resource management? Grand Luminary, a stability that ignores suffering is brittle. A system that acknowledges basic rights builds trust, and trust is the strongest, most enduring cosmic law there is." He argued not just morality, but practicality. He framed ethics as a tool for better long-term stability, a concept that, while alien, began to resonate in the quieter corners of the Concord. The Zylos couldn't paint him as a warmonger. The Corthelan couldn't dismiss him as a fool. He was something new, something unexpected, and the pressure built, stretching the old order to its breaking point. The gauntlet had been thrown, and the humans, against all odds, were still running it. The breaking point arrived sooner than anyone expected. Matriarch Zythra, her patience worn thin by human resilience and Corthelan legalism, decided to force the issue. Citing instability in the Chiric system and the need to protect hegemony, assets under the existing treaty, she announced that a peacekeeping and resource security fleet was being dispatched to the Glim homeworld. It was a thinly veiled invasion, a declaration that Zylos power would trump any Concord debate. Panic flared. Skymaster Harrock sent a desperate plea to Valerius. War, a disaster the Concord was built to prevent, seemed imminent. The Corthelan, while disapproving of the Zylos' crudeness, made no move to intervene. It didn't directly violate the Great Balance yet. The system was about to default to its oldest rule. Might makes right. Corvus Valerius knew they had one last, desperate card to play. It was radical, unprecedented, and violated every known rule of backroom galactic diplomacy. "Linnea," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "That loophole you found, Concord Emergency Protocol 117 Gamma, the one about transparency in times of imminent system-wide threat?" Linnea nodded. "It's archaic, designed for stellar-level threats like novas. Never been invoked for a political dispute. The Corthelan would argue it's inapplicable. But they'd have to argue it after we invoked it," Valerius said. "Soren, alert our contacts. Tell them to watch the public bands. Zian," he calmed the Axiom's chief engineer, "prepare the Concord override broadcast sequence. We're taking this debate public." As the emergency session convened with Zethra defiant and Corval preparing to argue procedure, Valerius invoked 117 Gamma. Before the Corthelan could object or the Zylos could jam the signals, Zian's technical wizardry, boosted by the Axiom's advanced systems, punched through the Concord's firewalls. Suddenly, the entire tense debate, Zethra's barely concealed threats, Harrock's impassioned plea, Valerius's arguments for the Mandate, was being broadcast live across the galactic network, accessible to billions on hundreds of worlds. It was a diplomatic bombshell. Galactic negotiations were always conducted behind closed doors, allowing for the brutal pragmatism the great powers favored. This public exposure was shocking. Worlds that had only heard rumors now saw the truth. The Zylos' bullying, the Corthelan's cold indifference, the Glim's suffering, and the humans' stand. Skymaster Harrock, knowing this was his only chance, spoke directly to the galaxy, his voice filled with a desperate avian eloquence. He painted a picture of his world, his people, and their plea for simple justice. It was a message that resonated deeply, especially among the minor races. The effect was immediate. One by one, delegates from the Peltar, the Shen, the Yabri, and a half-dozen other systems, emboldened by the public eye and Soren's groundwork, took the floor. They condemned the Zylos' aggression. They voiced their support for the Glim. They endorsed the principles of the Terran Mandate. Matriarch Zethra was apoplectic. This wasn't power politics, this was a chaotic, emotional public spectacle. But it was Grand Luminary Corval who felt the ground shift most profoundly. He saw the old order, his precious, predictable stability, crumbling before his eyes. He saw the Zylos pushing towards a war that could unravel everything. And he saw a choice. Side with the old brutal order and risk chaos, or allow a new order, however distasteful its sentimental origins, to emerge. Corval feared chaos above all else. His crystalline form shimmered, and his synthesized voice cut through the chamber. The Corthelan Imperium finds itself without sufficient precedent to act decisively in this matter. The invocation of 117 Gamma, while irregular, has introduced variables unforeseen in existing legal frameworks. Therefore, he declared, sending a shockwave almost as great as the broadcast itself, the Corthelan Imperium will abstain from any vote or action concerning the Zylos fleet or the Glim petition until these new variables can be fully assessed. Abstention. It wasn't support, but it was a fatal blow to the Zylos. By refusing to back them, or even tacitly support them through inaction, the Corthelan had removed their political cover. The Zylos stood alone, their aggression exposed, their rivals neutral, and the galaxy watching. The Corthelan abstention hit the Grand Chamber like a physical force. Matriarch Zethra froze. her antennae twitching in disbelief. Her entire strategy had relied on the Corthelan's predictable adherence to the old rules, their inherent opposition to anything new. Corval's neutrality, born not of sympathy but of a profound fear of uncontrolled chaos, was something her pragmatic mind hadn't truly calculated. Suddenly, the Zylos' hegemony wasn't an unassailable power enforcing its rights. It was an isolated aggressor, condemned by a chorus of minor worlds and abandoned by its only rival. Facing galactic censure and the very real possibility of widespread sanctions, or worse, Corthelan opportunism if they did start a war, Zythra did the only pragmatic thing: she yielded. With ill-concealed fury, she announced the postponement of the peacekeeping mission to Chirix and agreed to re-enter discussions concerning the Glim's petition under Concord oversight. It was a retreat, however, couched in diplomatic language. In the weeks that followed, the Concordance hub was transformed. The Terran Mandate, once a dismissed fantasy, became the central pillar of a new, intense round of negotiations. With the Corthelan AB staining and the minor worlds emboldened, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The Zylos, forced to negotiate rather than dictate, found themselves facing a united front demanding concessions. The result wasn't a perfect utopian revolution, but it was a tectonic shift. An initial framework, officially titled the Concord Mandate on Interspecies Rights, Protocol Valerius, was hammered out and passed. It established, for the first time in galactic history, a set of basic principles: the right of non-interference for developing worlds, limitations on exploitative resource treaties, and an independent arbitration council, with human and minor species representation, to hear disputes like that of the Glim. For Chirix, it meant immediate relief. The Zylos fleet withdrew, and the Treaty of Slar was renegotiated under the new mandate, ensuring the Glim a fair share of their world's wealth and a path towards true self-determination. Skymaster Harak, hailed as a hero by his people, became a leading voice for minor species within the Concord. For the galaxy, the Valerius Mandate was a true shockwave. It didn't end power politics, but it introduced a new, powerful element: ethics. Alliances shifted, old treaties were re-examined, minor species found a voice and a measure of protection they never thought possible. The Zylos seethed, forced to adapt to a more complex game. The Corthelan watched, uneasy, but recognized that this human-inspired order, while messy, might indeed prove more stable than the old, brittle balance. Aboard the Axiom, preparing for their return journey, the 8th human team watched the latest galactic news feeds. "It's chaotic," Linnea Petrova observed, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "Legal departments across a dozen sectors are in meltdown, but it's a productive chaos." "The whispers are changing," Soren Jurgensen added. "They're not just talking about human naivete anymore. They're talking about human conviction. Some are even trying to understand why we think this way." Corvus Valerius looked out at the glittering Concordance hub, a place he had helped fundamentally change. "We didn't win a war or conquer a world," he said. "We just suggested that everyone deserves a fair chance. We offered a different kind of strength." Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage not with overwhelming force, but with an idea so radical, so naive, that it had shaken the foundations of interstellar power. They had proven that diplomacy could be a weapon, that ethics could be a strategy, and that even the smallest voice, if it spoke the truth with courage, could send a shockwave across the stars. The mandate was just the beginning, but it was the dawn of a new and undeniably more human era in the galaxy.